First, we'll go to Fort Worth, Texas, where the Iroquois helicopter is being built. This is the first aircraft designed specifically for Army use, and the first helicopter designed to use a gas turbine engine. It represents a significant breakthrough in the state of helicopter development.
In April 1961, the Royal Australian Air Force ordered 8 Bell Iroquois utility helicopters, designated HU-1B, from the Bell Helicopter Company in the United States. These gas turbine-powered aircraft marked a new era for Australian military aviation. The subsequent D and H models, which would go on to see service with No. 9 Squadron in Vietnam, were referred to as Deltas and Hotels, respectively. On the 11th of June 1962, No. 9 Squadron RAAF was reformed at the Williamtown base in New South Wales, under the command of Squadron Leader Ray Scott, equipped with the Bravo Iroquois helicopters ordered in 1961. Flight Lieutenant Brian Sullivan oversaw the unit's formation from scratch, while Scott and other pilots were training in the USA. Squadron Leader Scott found the infrastructure at Williamtown severely deficient. Scott secured the squadron's relocation to the Fairburn base in the Australian Capital Territory in November 1962. On the 29th of October 1962, 8 Bravo Iroquois arrived at the Fairburn Air Base, with the first RAAF crew flying the helicopters in November. In February the following year, 9 Squadron commenced high-altitude training near Mount Kosciuszko, Australia's highest peak. Later in 1963, 2 Iroquois were transported by C-130 to Lae in Papua New Guinea for tropical environment training. The squadron's primary role soon shifted to Army support, driven by increasing demand from the Australian Army. This role, with its extensive and frequent tasking, fully extended the squadron's limited manpower and resources. Between 1962 and 1966, 9 Squadrons Iroquois supported civilian communities across Australia and beyond, undertaking a wide variety of tasks that showcased the helicopter's versatility in disaster relief and recovery operations. On the 31st of March 1963, during severe floods in southwest Queensland, 11 people were stranded on the roof of the Addervale Hotel. A 9 Squadron Iroquois, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Bob McIntosh, along with his crew, rescued them. Over the following 4 days, 2 Iroquois rescued a total of 93 people and delivered food and medical supplies to isolated homesteads in the flood-affected region. In February to March 1965, a Trans-Australian Airways Otter aircraft landed in a swamp 6 miles from Iome near Madang, Papua New Guinea. 9 Squadron was tasked with recovering the aircraft. From 1962 to 1966, under Squadron Leader Ray Scott's pragmatic leadership, 9 Squadron had established the Iroquois as a cornerstone of Royal Australian Air Force operations.
On the 8th of March 1966, Australian Prime Minister Holt announced a substantial increase in Australian forces in Vietnam. This would include a combined Army and RAAF task force, and their tactical area of responsibility would be Phuoc Toi Province. Australian headquarters was established in Saigon. On the 3rd of May 1966, the first 9 Squadron detachment arrived at Vung Tau, while No. 5 Squadron at Fairburn became the Aircrew and Ground Crew Training Squadron to feed new personnel into 9 Squadron operating in Vietnam.
Most people wanted to go to fighters, and the last place most people wanted to go was helicopters, because by that stage, at least within the Air Force, there was a bit of a bias against helos and that what was going on in Vietnam. I wasn't surprised, and I was somewhat how would I put it, quite pleased to be going to helicopters at 5 Squadron at Fairburn, near Canberra.
We had a very disjointed conversion. Started off badly. We arrived there and there was a flight lieutenant, TCO of the squadron at the time. We were a week early. "What are you doing here?" And Flight Lieutenant Gill said, "Well, go away, come back next week when everything's..." And So we came on, had an extra week's leave. Came back, started the course, and about a month later, we had a fatal accident. 2 ops flight guys were killed, one of whom was a New Zealand officer on exchange. He was passing through 5 Squadron on his way to Vietnam. But it came as a bit of a shock, but not a total shock, because the Air Force in those days, you expected people to die, expected people to have crashes and things. It's not the case these days, I'm happy to say. After the squadron was ungrounded, without any conclusive reason why the aircraft had broken up in flight, in early April, so 3 months into the course, 2 of our course mates were killed when another aircraft broke up in flight, another Bravo. After which the squadron was grounded for quite some time. A whole bunch of different maintenance people were brought back into the system. Suddenly our serviceability went from something like about 10 or 15% to 80%, and that problem went away.
We graduated off conversion course, and you came off course as a DCAT captain, so you could be a captain in the training area and a co-pilot outside the training area. And then fairly rapidly, as you're exposed to Army and Navy support and Air Force support, you gain skills in doing more than just flying the aircraft around. And then every so many months there'd be a bunch of individual unit training exercises with the Army and ourselves, so 1 or 2 aircraft and a company or a battalion, but 1 company at a time. Culminated in multi-unit, multi-formation exercises at Shoalwater Bay, the training area north of Rockhampton and Yeppoon.
Yeah, I can still remember arriving in Saigon and the just how. Look, first of all, there was the smell. I don't know what the smell was of, but it was absolutely everything. And just the confusion and just stuff lying around, very messy. We wound up, Foxy and I wound up getting put on a USAF C-130B to go down to Vung Tau, and that came as a bit of a shock too, in that we'd been used to flying Australian Hercs, which were quite pristine. This thing seemed to have hydraulic oil running down the walls, and the guys were wearing Nomex trousers and T-shirts, the crew. And anyway, we made it okay. Down to Vung Tau, got there just as it was getting dark, and I remember we got put on a 5-ton truck and driven up, had no idea where we were, driven up to the living area. And I remember Foxy, who was an ex-airman, stopped outside the quarters, and Foxy saying, "Well, this is okay, but where's the officers' accommodation?" And there were these 2-storey grey wooden buildings, and over to the right was the officers' mess, painted green. And very shortly thereafter, Nugget Hibben, the CO, turned up to welcome us aboard. We now had 364 days to go.
When we got to Phuoc Tuy province in Vietnam, we looked back at Shoalwater Bay training area, and there was a remarkable resemblance in the topography and a fair bit of the tree cover and so on. Lots of mangrove swamps and rivers, mountains and heavily clad jungle, different jungle, but the flora was similar enough. It was a very, very good introduction to joint operations in a Southeast Asian setting. And then the squadron had the 9th Squadron in Vietnam had about 36 pilots or thereabouts by that stage. And all the ground crew and air crew rotated through the squadron over the years so that you kept a reasonable balance of experience. And of course, unforeseen events kept on interfering with that smooth flow, but it worked pretty well.
9 Squadron RAAF operated from Vung Tau airfield in Vietnam from May 1966 to November 1971. in support of the 1st Australian Task Force during the Vietnam War. The Task Force main base was at Nui Dat. 9 Squadron flew Iroquois helicopters known as Hueys and first operated 8 UH-1B Bravo models. The Bravo models were gradually replaced with larger UH-1D and then more powerful UH-1H models, until the squadron operated 16 of the UH-1H Hotel models from about mid-1968. The Hueys cruised at about 90 to 105 knots, with a maximum airspeed of 120 knots for about 2 hours on aviation turbine fuel.
The first flight you normally did was on Albatross 05. The first 4 aircraft, Albatross 01 to 04, were the slicks to do a platoon lift if you wanted. 05 was the aircraft that would fly the brigadier, the task force commander, around for the day wherever he wanted to go. So you were based at Vung Tau rather than Nui Dat. The first 4 would go up to Nui Dat with a couple of bushrangers. A dust-off would be at the field ambulance at Nui Dat. And 05 was flying at relatively high altitude to protect the brigadier and have a fly around and take him wherever he wanted to go. So that was normally your introduction.
When you went to 9 Squadron, you started right back at the beginning, which was, most people thought, a very sensible way of doing it. So you go out as a co-pilot, and then you'd graduate up the risk level of, or importance of the various missions. And so the missions went from, say, Albatross 01 was the call sign of the lead aircraft, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, Albatross 08 if it was a big push. And then there were the bushrangers, Bushranger 71 and 72, with a third one that was kept on standby back at Nui Dat. And so you graduated through those 2 streams. Everyone gets checked out and flies on the bushrangers, but most would only fly as co-pilot, including me. And then the others would end up being a slick captain or a medevac captain, including me. And then some junior blokes would end up being flight lead in either the bushrangers or the slicks. And if he's a second tourist, probably both.
The standard crew on a 9 Squadron Iroquois was pilot, co-pilot, crewman in charge of loading and operation of the rescue hoist and gun on the right side of the cargo compartment, and gunner, who would operate the machine gun on the left side and help the crewman.
I went to Vietnam a couple of times, and my second trip in 1970-71 I spent as a door gunner. I volunteered, as quite a number of airfield defence guards had, to become door gunners. And in fact, the helicopter beside me here, my second day of training as a door gunner, was on this very helicopter. And if you can picture it taking off from Nui Dat with 15 people on board, we're quite literally getting ready to go, and we kept on getting people coming up, Americans and Australians. Where are you going? Where are you going? Oh, we're going here, we're going there, we're going everywhere. Oh, I'm going to this particular place. Can I get a lift? Yeah, climb on board.
Embedded in 9 Squadron for most of its deployment in Vietnam were pilots of the Royal New Zealand Air Force, there were 16 in total, and a contingent of 9 Royal Australian Navy pilots.
For the 8 of us that went to 9 Squadron to be operating in direct support of the Australian Army was something a bit different, very different to the normal Navy routines. And of course that was the same thing for the Navy who went to the 135th integration with the American Army. It was something quite different to our normal operations from Navy aircraft carrier. In the 707 going over to Vietnam with me was another Navy pilot who was on his way to the joint Australian Navy US Army operation. His name was Vic Batiste, and Vic was on his way to be the replacement pilot for a fellow who'd been killed just a few weeks before. A bullet went through his helmet, and a lovely man, Pat Vickers, was the first Navy casualty. And so I was acutely aware, probably more than the other Air Force on 9 Squadron, that things happen. We did have an armoured seat, and before we took off, the crewman would slide a protective armour forward on the outside of the aircraft. So basically we were sitting in a seat of armour up fairly high in the back. We had a helmet on which didn't necessarily stop a bullet. And we had this side thing, depending on which side of the aircraft, this side protecting you. And also, we, and the Americans did it too, we had a pistol, the pilots always had a pistol, and you'd slide the pistol around in between your legs to give you a bit of protection in important parts there. So, but you were aware that there was a chance. We were in operations, and that's what happens when you're in operations.
My time with 9 Squadron was a little bit hectic. During the 6 months I was there, we lost at least 5 helicopters. One in which one of my mates on the same Airfield Defence Guard course was a crewman, and he was medevac back to Australia. The skipper of that aircraft and the gunner had been killed. The co-pilot stayed in Vietnam, although he'd been injured. He recovered and went back flying.
All 9 Squadron ground and aircrew rotated through the squadron on staggered 12-month tours of duty to maintain a good spread of competence. A trickle of experience was sent home to be replaced by a trickle of new crew. Occasionally tours were extended. Many served 2 and a few 3 tours. Most of the aircraft were slicks, or troop and cargo carrying versions, with 2 M60 machine guns, one on each side, for self-defence, and a rescue hoist.
It's strange that I have a great deal of difficulty climbing up ladders, yet I had no problem at all in sitting in a helicopter and doing the job. On one of the battalions returning home, I was the gunner on a chopper that did 27 trips to the ship from Newydad. Load up with troops, fly out, drop them off, fly back to Newydad, back forward. So that was a big day. Now, of course, we were hooked up to the fuselage of the aircraft by what we called a monkey strap, big strap buckled around our waist and hooked up to the fuselage. And in fact, one of my mates on what we called a hash and trash, taking hot boxes of food out to a fire support base. On the way back, an empty hot box fell out. His skipper asked him to move forward and make sure nothing else fell out. Well, he fell out. So he's got his safety, his monkey strap on, hooked up to the fuselage, dangling below the skids, and it took, I believe, the co-pilot, the crewman and a passenger to drag him back up. And I'm told that he was quite visibly shaken and still trembling after a few beers in the Airmen's Club later on that day.
The slicks could, and often did, conduct what was known as a dust-off, or a rescue of casualties. When tasked as a dedicated dust-off aircraft, usually an Army or RAAF medic was carried in addition to the usual 4 crew. The call sign of the slicks would be Albatross 01, who was the flight lead, followed by Albatross 02, Albatross 03, and so on.
When the Americans started pulling out in late 1970, 9 Squadron took over formal responsibility for medevac. 9 Squadron never stopped doing medevac the whole time, but we took over the formal responsibility.
I really enjoyed dust off because you were generally on your own, and you got to do something quite unusual, maybe at night or maybe out of province or whatever. And I had one of those where it was out of province. The US dust off had been shot up, staggered off to die, staggered off to crash somewhere, and we were invited to go, and we did a really long wincher that the jungle there must have been the best part of 200 foot high, so it was a very, remember it's 256 foot was the length of the cable, and we used a lot of it and did 2 double winches while the American on the other end of the radio on the ground is having a major panic. And eventually, fortunately, he got kicked off the radio and someone competent took over, and anyway, we got 4 guys out of there.
I had one where we were hovering above the jungle. I was the gunner. Crewman was winching up a wounded patient from the combined Anzac company. The contact was still happening down below. What we as the crew didn't know as we were carrying on with our tasks was that a pair of American Cobra gunships had been authorised to come in and do firing passes. There were some very expletive deleted comments when they opened up with their rockets and machine guns. We didn't know what the devil was going. We were concentrating on what was happening. The Medevac's landing pad at number 1 hospital at Vung Tau was named Vampire Pad. So if you were heading into Vampire Pad, they knew that you had some seriously wounded people on board. Some of them didn't make it, of course, but then, of course, the medevacs would happen with the C-130s taking them to Butterworth and then back on to Australia and all that sort of stuff.
Any Australian chopper could do a medevac, and our crewmen were first aid trained, but when we took over responsibility, we just kept a standard slick, no Red Crosses, kept all the arms, and if it wasn't urgent, the dedicated chopper would do it, particularly at night, because it would be the only Huey up at Nui Dat, and there'd be another one immediate standby back at Vung Tau as a backup. But and that's how it was before the Yanks took over. But then we decided we kept the standby at Vung Tau and then placed an immediate standby at the Red Earth Regimental Aid Post on the helipad at Nui Dat. And so the crew slept up there overnight or just hung around there during the day. But if a slick was out on a mission and was close, that time being the essence, the slick could go in and did it, and often did. And that went on the whole 5.5 years that 9 Squadron was there.
The maintenance crews aim to have 13 of the normal 16 aircraft available for tasking each day. Rarely was the aim missed, even when the squadron had lost aircraft to enemy action. And 2 were not replaced for quite a while. The 9 Squadron ground crew were magnificent, and their competence and dedication were crucial to the impressive aircraft serviceability rate, and thus the operational effectiveness of the squadron.
In my role as an airframe fitter, we did just general unserviceabilities, C servicings, A servicings, D servicings on the aircraft, which entailed in removing components, the heads, blades, etc., rebalance them to get them refitted. Flight line work, like duty crew, you do that every so often. And refuel aircraft, doing test flights, rectifications, all that sort of things. Up in 9 Squadron Vung Tau, you basically the same work we did in Canberra, but it was on different conditions. It was fairly hot. You never know what's going to happen next. When you finish work, you head off back to the blocks. Depends what time you get back, you have a shower or not. Straight to the boozer, and then tea and shower and back down the boozer again. And it's just everyday life. Whatever gets thrown at you, you just got to take it on board and handle it, whatever it is with everyone else.
With the very high rate of effort of flying, the flying hours that were flown each day, that was a massive, unrelenting task for the wonderful maintenance people. The Iroquois would come back and land at night, go into the revetments. The aircraft captain would sign them off to maintenance, or they may have come back earlier because of an unserviceability. So then the maintenance staff would be straight into that to get them repaired, so that we could always keep our 12 aircraft online, serviceable per day. And that was a massive task.
There was this constant push to get more and more power and more reliability. And so when there's a war on, I guess people just push a bit hard. And we were really pushing the aircraft hard because everything needed to be done yesterday.
Well, I thought we were quite efficient. It was interesting. We had a little bit to do with the Americans, but we had a very good equipment officer who used to go over and see the Americans, and it's amazing what you could barter with. And if we were short of particular pieces of equipment, we managed to end up getting it.
We could use the limited resources we had really, really well. And of course there was always the situation where a case of Foster's beer could be traded for a helicopter engine, or you know, we were amazingly proficient, as Australians always have been, in making the best out of what was available in swapping things and getting other assistance.
The normal time between overhaul for the jet engines and the Huey was about 1,000 hours back in Australia and in peacetime in the US. And we were around about 100 hours between overhauls on many of the engines, not all of them. And at one stage there, we were losing, it happened to me once, the fourth stage of the compressor would break and the rest of the engine would go out the jet pipe. And yeah, that happened to me, Norm Goodall, at the rearm point at Nui Dat, backing out the gunship and at full power and still bouncing off the skids, and there was a great sheet of flame past my left ear. I only had time to sort of stop the yaw and we were already on the ground. I think we bent the skids or something. But the gunships were really heavy to go out. And several of the blokes had similar engine failures and put it into the swamp or the beach or the jungle. So you were pretty careful about assessing risk, whereas most of the time you're over the jungle, well, you know you're going to go into the jungle, but you try to minimise that exposure.
Three of the Hotel Iroquois were configured as gunships. Call sign Bushranger 7-1, indicating the lead aircraft, and Bushranger 7-2 and 7-3. The gunships were crewed by two pilots, a crewman and a gunner.
I became qualified as a door gunner on gunships. When it came time to providing support to Army units that were in strife, if we were on the gunships, we would go out, we'd be getting indications of where to lay down our suppression fire. The pilots got very, very good at operating the Gatling machine guns and the rocket pods, and we would linger as long as we could while the guys were in strife until such time as either fuel or ammunition forced us to go back.
They did not have a rescue hoist fitted. They were armed each side with twin M60 machine guns, a total of 4, each with 750 rounds of 7.62 caliber belted ammunition. There was also fixed forward firing miniguns with a total of 10,000 rounds of 7.62 caliber ammunition fed to both guns, and a rocket pod with 7 rockets. These were 2.75 inch diameter folding fin aerial rockets, and the aircraft carried a total of 14. The rockets could be fitted with high explosives for bunkers and vehicles, flechette for anti-personnel, or white phosphorus heads for target marking. There were usually 2, 1 in each rocket pod. 2 gunships were called a light fire team. 3 gunships were a heavy fire team. Each dawn usually following an intelligence and operations brief at Dingo Operations at Vung Tau. 4 slicks, Albatross 01 to 04, and 2 gunships, Bushranger 7-1 and 7-2, would leave Vung Tau for the 10 to 15 minute flight to Nui Dat, or to a planned mission, then recover to Nui Dat for further planned tasks, or wait at Kangapad on immediate standby for unplanned tasks. At Kangapad, there was a number of refuel points and a small duty crew of 9 squadron maintenance personnel at the Gunship rearm point. Often pre-planned tasking meant that most or all crews and aircraft would move direct to tasks or land at Huey Dat before departing on task in company with part or all of the remainder of the squadron. The Bushranger gunships almost always operated as a tactical pair, or 3-ship, with Bushranger 7-1 as flight lead. The Albatross slicks often operated in pairs or larger formations. For example, SAS patrol insertions or extractions, or troop moves, with Albatross 01 as flight lead, usually in coordination with Bushranger 7-1 and 7-2 providing fire support. When coordinating a large operation, the commanding officer of 9 Squadron, or senior 9 Squadron executives, would fly as mission lead in an Iroquois fitted with extra communications and carrying the ground commander and staff. Their call sign would be Albatross Charlie Charlie. They would direct the slicks and gunships to best meet the objectives of the mission in coordination with other supporting arms. For example, naval gunfire, airstrikes and artillery. There were many routine tasks flown by 9 Squadron slicks on various single or multi-aircraft tasks, such as logistic resupply, liaison, reconnaissance, special ops, spray, maintenance test flights, medevac, and so on. Planned tasking of 9 Squadron was from the 1 ATF Tactical Air Operations Centre at Huey Dat through Dingo Ops at Vung Tau. Tactical Air Operations was manned by Army and RAAF personnel, including a 9 Squadron executive, who would plan tasking of operations for the next day and pass on that plan to 9 Squadron via Dingo operations in Vung Tau. Unplanned tasks would be sorted immediately by radio when airborne, or by phone if the flight leaders and crews were at the 9 Squadron Alert Shack at Kangapad.
Probably the majority of our work, not 51+%, but say, I don't know, 25 to 45% with support of the SAS. And while 9 Squadron wasn't the only means of them going into their patrol areas, we were the normal means and probably the overwhelmingly normal mean of getting them in, but particularly getting them out, because we were the only ones that could react in time.
Within a few days of me arriving in Vietnam, I was co-pilot on an insertion of a SAS patrol. The number 2 SAS Squadron had only just arrived in Vietnam at that stage, about the same time I did. And this was one of their first jobs, a fairly big job, or important job. And for me, this was absolute new stuff. You know, the terrifying stories of putting an SAS patrol on the ground, taking only seconds to do it, and getting out and doing that in a way that other units around the jungle wouldn't have known where you landed, wouldn't have known what's going on, and that was the routine. And so here's me co-pilot my very first SAS insertion. We are not able to actually put the skids on the ground, which often happened. So we're hovering at low level, and one of the SAS soldiers getting out of the aircraft severely damaged his ankle. He really did a big job. It wasn't broken, but it was sprained in a number of different ways, and right away they knew that this guy was a liability on the ground, and he couldn't stay. And so, having taken off from this little area where we just put this patrol, we were asked to go back and collect this guy who had done a job on his ankle. And so we basically did a quick circuit and went back into the same spot, picked up this injured man, took him away. And that was extremely unusual. I don't think it ever happened again that they sort of went twice into the same spot inserting.
There's an SAS patrol that I'd inserted later in the piece, and we used to fly away and wait for about 20 minutes, the formation There'd be the flight leader, the 02, which was the aircraft that dropped off the SAS, the 03, the spare, in case something went badly wrong, and 2 gunships. And we'd go and hold somewhere away and wait and see if the SAS were okay. And in this case, after 5 minutes, instead of coming up on their beeper, and then someone just held down the press to transmit, and you could hear automatic weapons fire in the background. So I figured, probably not going well, going to have to go back. And after it all got sorted, we went back to pick these guys up. And there were some things, very few things that I remember quite vividly, but this one was quite vivid, as we're coming down final, the collective on the floor, decelerating, nose high, and being overtaken by a rocket down the left side from a gunship, and seeing a tree explode out to the gunships were brassing up the left side of the pad, the SAS were coming out of the right. Plonked on the ground, there's probably 5 guys, about 5 guys, running across out of the tree line, and then I see these big gouts of earth being driven out of on the way towards these guys, and thinking, Jesus, this is looking really bad. And then I realised a second or so later it was the SAS guy firing over his shoulder, stitching up the ground 5 feet behind him.
The SAS and 9 Squadron were a well-practiced and harmonious team. Navigation within the 1 ATF area of operations was visual, using 1 in 100,000 or 50,000 scale tactical maps, with a 1,000 metre grid overlay and covered in plastic laminate. Coloured aerial recce photography was used when detail was necessary and available. Navigation beyond the 1 ATF area of operation was visual, using adjacent tactical maps, or ONC air navigation maps if venturing further afield. For example, a 1 in 500,000 or 1 in 1 million air navigation maps. Usually flights were above small arms range at 1,500 feet above ground level in the area of operation. If operating at low level, aircraft flew as close to the treetops as possible. Most of the area of operation was covered in jungle. However, low-level flight over open country was avoided if possible. During medevac at night, there was often a difficult trade-off between the risk of hitting ground and obstacles or being hit by ground fire. There were no night vision devices, and night navigation was visual, often below lowest safe height due to cloud overcast.
But when you're close to the ground, and the field of view in the jungle is not very good unless you're really close. And when we did our tactical approaches, we approached quite fast and with a rapid change in speed and direction and altitude, and you're in before, and if they're not right at the edge of the jungle, where they're exposed to M60s and SAS people with some serious bloody weaponry, you're really going to spoil their aim. So with the insertion and extractions, aircraft got hit, and but I don't think we ever lost someone as a direct result of enemy action, although we did lose Corporal David Fisher doing a suspended hot extraction, and he fell from one of the ropes en route. And the SAS did take casualties in the jungle, but I don't think, when 9 Squadron was supporting them, I don't think we ever lost anyone in that 5.5 years. And to do that, you've got to have a lot of luck, but you better have a lot more than luck. But I think that towards the end, particularly from about March, April onwards, with the Yanks pulling out, it was time for us to go. I don't know that, but I suspect the regular forces were moving down, regular NVA were moving in, and we would have come up against a much sterner challenge.
I was the gunner on the helicopter that brought out the last SAS patrol, and when we picked them up, they'd been in water up to about their thighs for quite some time, clearing the area and making sure that everything was secure. If they got bumped, they wanted to be out of the area very, very quickly. They did have a very, very good working relationship with the squadron. Sadly, it was a member of the SAS. I'm not sure whether he was a signaller or a trooper, one of the 6 that was missing in action at the end of the Vietnam conflict. They'd been in strife, 9 Squadron helicopter had come across, they couldn't land, so they'd thrown ropes down, something the patrols had practiced many times. Hook onto the rope and away you go. Unfortunately with this gentleman, something went wrong. He fell about 60 metres and he couldn't be recovered at the time. It was about 17 years ago that an army team located his body along with the 3 other soldiers that were missing in action in Vietnam.
The SAS patrols were the eyes and ears of the task force, the Australian task force. And so how it evolved, and it evolved very quickly in the early days. A lot of the SAS and early squadron leaders and so on in 9 Squadron came up with the tactics of insertion and extraction of SAS patrols. And so some days before a particular patrol was to go out to recce their tactical area of responsibility or their little operating area, patrol leader and his 2IC and maybe his comms bloke would come down to the 9 Squadron alert shack at Nui Dat, and they'd talk to the bloke who was going to be flight lead on the day that they were getting inserted. And so often that was me, but not only, plenty of other blokes did it too. So they'd come down and or whoever was doing the job, would be on a lesser alert aircraft. And we'd just hop in this aircraft and go out and have a look at the province without showing any undue interest of any part of it. And then you'd pore over the maps and the photographs and you'd agree with the patrol leader where it was going and what was the alternate if the first preference was unavailable. And so several days later, Albatross 01, occasionally me again, the patrol would come down to the shack and then all the crews involved, so you'd have a lead, Albatross 01 was the lead, you'd have Albatross 02 would be the aircraft that took the patrol, and Albatross 03 would be the spare, and occasionally, not very often, you might have 2 patrols going in and 2 spares, but normally it was just 1, 2, 3 slicks and 2 gunships, Bushranger 7-1, the lead, Bushranger 7-2. So all those crews would brief with the patrol. You go out, mount up, start engines, and you'd all fly off together. And then once up at altitude and clear of Nui Dat, the gunships right from the start would drift out so that they could cover, so they were in a tactical formation, and the slicks would stay in a finger formation so that they had tactical mobility within the formation and wouldn't conflict or minimise confliction with the gunships. And then some time before you got to the insertion pad, Albatross 01 would send 02 with a patrol on down to low level because we had no GPS and jungle looks pretty much like jungle wherever you are. And so the SAS blokes loved that part. You know, we used to call it going down the mine. And you'd see them sitting there with it, because there were no doors, the doors pulled back, crewmen and gunner either side of an M60 and the 5 or 6 or sometimes only 4 blokes with their feet hanging out with big grins on their face. So they took this sleigh ride past the jungle. And then as the 02 bird was approaching the pad, 01 would start counting off and giving directions. And so he'd go into the pad, and as the aircraft landed, out they'd go. And then the aircraft, as fast as it could, would roll through and then take off. And the gunships would have been set up on a pattern so they would roll in if they had to, and then they'd continue on. Then, after so many kilometres at low level, clicks, 02 would climb up and join the other 2 slicks, and the gunships would stay in close proximity, and we just go into a holding pattern, well clear of ear shot and eyesight, and wait to hear if we heard from the patrol. And occasionally you would, so they'd have to go back and pull them out because they'd run into trouble.
First time that I ever did as co-pilot with Bevan Pettit, an SAS insertion which went bad. We landed in the pad, came to the hover, we all heard a gunshot. This was after the SAS guys had deplaned. Flew away knowing we're going to have to go back and pick these guys up again. And so at that stage I was quite new, so I thought I'll defend this part of the aircraft with my trusty 9mm Browning, which when we got there, whoever had been there from the opposition had probably departed the scene because there'd been gunships and whatever. SAS all jumped on and we flew, and I thought, God, I've cocked this thing. What do I do? And I thought, do I shoot it out the window to get rid of the round up the spout or whatever? Anyway, I finally got that resolved, but I resolved after that the most dangerous thing in Vietnam was going to be me and a Browning 9mm, so I always kept an empty magazine in it and carried a full one on should I need it.
One day I was doing it. It was the new SAS squadron, and he was a Brit, Andy, and I can't think of his surname for the moment. And we briefed his patrol. He went in. I think Ward Rayner was the captain of the 02 aircraft with a patrol on board. I think Ivers Filkins was the co-pilot, and I'm up the top and I'm running him into the pad, and as he's flaring to land on the pad, someone called out enemy on the pad, and so Wood, pretty experienced bloke, just rotated and started flying off, and as he started to rotate like that, one of the SAS patrol levitated out of the aircraft and suddenly realised he was on his own and went into a bomb crater close to where the aircraft was. And I'm about to call, and before I could say anything, Ward Rayner had done a quick 360, came back, and this bloke then levitated again out of the crater onto the aircraft, and the gunships had rolled in already, and then we just ran them to an alternate pad down the way and put them in. But we didn't think they were going to stay out there for very long. And then, sure enough, a few days later, they went hot, and we went and pulled them out. We could do it without comms if we had to. And I can't remember whether we needed comms on that one. But when they were fighting, keeping the enemy at bay, I often didn't have time to talk. And so you'd come in, and then the patrol would leapfrog, one pair would cover, and then the next pair would prop, and the other pair would come back. And meanwhile, the side guns would help protect them on board the aircraft and in Scarpa.
But, the one thing I do remember mostly in '69, it was on October the 15th, we did a SAS rope extraction with the CO, Nugget Heaven. We got into a bit of strife and landing. We got over the edge of the trees, and I was just swinging over the trees, and I had to tell the co-pilot when to release, because he was in control of the rope release mechanism. And apparently he broke his thumb because he didn't totally pull the pin out, the lock pin out, and he had to really reef past the lock pin when I told him to release. And I released them so that they just touched the ground. And as soon as that happened, I heard this thing, and we sort of went off to the left, and away we went. And the next thing I heard, I just seen your rotor go through 3,000 feet. And that was from one of the gunship captains. We had a rotor separation, got the blokes on the ground all right, nice and safely, thank goodness. That was a rope extraction, of course. And we went over and crashed in another part of the place where we were getting them on the ground. We all came down and we all landed up the right way. our old aircraft was a bit of a worse for wear, I must admit. I've got photographs of it there somewhere. They blew it up in situ, the SAS blokes did, later on down the track that day or the day after.
Myself and another bloke got tasked to take a US Marine forward observer up, and we were pouring huge naval gunfire rounds into the Long Highs, and the Long Highs that was bear country. When we went into the Long Highs, we ended up getting a bloody nose. And so I just locked the throttle, and we were just flying around in figure eights and circles, while the Marine with the radio on the back's directing the naval gunfire. So it looked like they were firing 44-gallon drums of high explosive into the Long Highs, and it's granite riddled with caves. And we're getting towards the end of our fuel. You could get 2 hours out of a Huey, and I'd got 2 hours, but it was time to start going home. And the gunfire was over, and the Marine said, "Can we go and have a look?" And I looked at the crew, and everybody sort of rolled their eyes and said, "You know, is it really important?" And he said, "Oh yeah, we've got to go and do it." And I said, "Okay." And we went, told the crewmen, you know, get ready to fire in defence to destroy there. And we did a big descending, curving, accelerating, decelerating run past the target area, and it lit up like the side of the hill lit up. They were pretty angry with us. And I asked the Marine if he wanted to go back for a second look. He said, "No, we've seen enough, thanks." So we went back to Nuidat. But I think at first he thought, you know, we were a bit gun shy, which we were.
During the Vietnam War, No. 2 and No. 35 squadrons of the Royal Australian Air Force operated under close coordination with United States forces, particularly in partnership with the Military Assistance Command Vietnam. While 9 Squadron was primarily in direct support of the 1st Australian Task Force, within the designated area of operation for most of their tasks, most of the time.
When you're so big, I mean overwhelmingly big, I would probably do it the way the Yanks did it. In other words, they specialised, they had special units, whereas we only had one unit of 16 aircraft, and they were training, the US Army alone was training more pilots a month than the Australian Defence Force would do in a year, and probably much more. And then there were Marines, and then there was the Navy, and then there was the Air Force, and all we did was plug into their logistics system. I think the Australian taxpayer paid so many hundreds of dollars, US dollars, for us to be provided with ammunition, fuel and spares. And we just plugged straight into that system, and a sensible way of going.
There were 3 of the 4 midshipmen on our course went to helicopters and all served with the 135th in Vietnam, and they had a seriously exciting time. There was an American unit with a bunch of Australian Navy guys in there. Oh, geez, I'm glad I wasn't there. I mean, their flight line wasn't secure at night, so you did a really good pre-flight. Yeah, one of the, Roger Cooper, was a gunship pilot, was shot down at least once, twice, I think. He describes how when you've been shot down in a paddy field and there's a whole bunch of bad guys in the tree line, you can actually hide behind the skid. You can get that low. So they did have a much more dangerous environment, I think, as well.
From what I observed flying with the 45th medevac versus in combat with a fight going on, the American aircrew the Army aircrew were undertrained by our standards, but when you're that big, and they perhaps could afford it, we couldn't. We're too small to emulate what they did. And their serviceability and usability of the aircraft wasn't as good as what we had. But then again, we were paying them to supply us with it. And if you went into a fight to pull out the wounded and dead, in the middle of a fight, to me, as an Air Force pilot, looking at what was going on, there was a fight going on 200 metres up the fire trail, but there didn't seem to be a lot of urgency behind that immediate fight. Whereas just going with a routine resupply mission to an Australian battalion in the field, it was the radio calls were very slick. They were obviously on the job, very clipped, very professional, not much talk. And when you landed, the backload was ready, and you didn't see anybody except the people doing the loading and unloading. And occasionally you caught a glimpse of someone else, but that someone else was obviously defending a perimeter, where that wasn't the case with the Yanks. And often, I had to get out one stage with the US crewmen and help load the bodies and the wounded, whereas that wouldn't have happened. You didn't want to get out of the aircraft at that stage.
So they threw people at the issue. Their warrant officer pilot training scheme was enormous, and people got to Vietnam to fly as co-pilots in Vietnam with absolutely minimal experience in the US system, where our guys were, even if we were just off pilot's course, we were relatively more experienced. I don't know, but I suspect that we expected to take more losses, or the hierarchy expected us to do, because when you look back, they were World War II and Korean War people, and they did take a lot of losses. And it didn't happen, I think, as much as anything else, because we were pretty professional. I'm sure people have spoken about the angst between the Army and the Air Force as to what we could do and what we couldn't do, but as a boggy pilot, I never came across that. Maybe we were shielded from a little bit, but we never knocked back a task just because things were going bad. We didn't say, oh no, quit. But I think we were a small unit, good camaraderie. We knew each other, knew each other's limitations and experience, and that was the difference, I think.
One of the other tasks was a thing called sniffer. Aircraft rigged up like this. They had a meter box in the fuselage, pipes going out onto the skids. They would bring air into the machine. It could read the air and the components in it, and if there was smoke or sulphur, that might indicate an enemy camp.
From November 1970, Australia began an orderly withdrawal from Vietnam, culminating in No. 9 Squadron's final mission on the 19th of November 1971. After 5.5 years and over 58,000 flying hours supporting the 1st Australian Task Force. In December, its 16 Iroquois helicopters lifted off from Vung Tau and were embarked aboard HMAS Sydney. The ship sailed via Townsville before docking at Caloundra. There, the aircraft dramatically flew off in formation to RAAF base Amberley, arriving in precision flight. Most squadron personnel had departed Vietnam on the 17th of December, flown to Townsville, joined with Royal Australian Navy crew, maintenance teams, and elements of 4 RAR, and marched through the city in a farewell ceremony. The final departure came a day later on the 18th, when Flight Lieutenant John Thine, designated as the Safe Hand Officer, left aboard a C-130 Hercules, marking the end of No. 9 Squadron's Vietnam chapter.
Come the end, there was a group who were selected to go onto the Sydney and travel with the aircraft. The aircraft were flown onto the Sydney and prepped, and then flown off at Townsville and then flown down to Amberley by that group of people, and the maintainers and everybody else to do it. Everybody else, okay, you're flying home on what we call the Freedom Bird, a Qantas charter flight. So everybody would go on that, except for one person who had to act as the safe hand officer for the squadron safes with all the secret stuff to come home on a Hercules. And the person selected for that would always be the junior pilot officer. Guess who that was? So the guys on the Freedom Bird all left on the 16th, and I got my Herc out on the 17th, so I was the last 9 Squadron pilot to leave Vietnam.
You hear a lot of stories about how people had issues with coming back after Vietnam, and relatively few of our guys did, because you were with your friends before, during and even after. They were the same people, and if you wanted to talk drivel about what happened, there was always someone to listen to you.
Back on Australian soil, 9 Squadron quickly resumed operations. Training deployments, tropical exercises in Papua New Guinea, and trials with the Air Movements Trial and Development Unit refined their methods for transporting helicopters via C-130 aircraft and the rigging of external loads. These years were marked by experimentation, adaptation, and the codification of helicopter doctrine. From 1972 to 1974, the squadron played a critical role in mapping operations across Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, operating in high-density altitude environments that led to the development of new flight procedures and safety standards. Between 1976 and 1979, Australia contributed 4 Iroquois helicopters and around 50 personnel, primarily from No. 5 Squadron, to the United Nations Emergency Force 2 in the Sinai. Operating in support of peacekeeping operations following the Yom Kippur War, the detachment provided vital air transport, logistics and liaison support across the Desert Buffer Zone, marking one of the RAAF's earliest sustained peacekeeping commitments. The late 1970s were also marked by tragedy. In 1978, during night training near Port Augusta, an Iroquois crashed into terrain, killing all on board, including the squadron's commanding officer, Wing Commander Peter Mayhood. It was a sobering reminder of the inherent risks of military aviation, even outside of wartime. Throughout the 1980s, 9 Squadron was central to exercises like Shifting Sands and Diamond Dollar, which tested and validated emerging air-mobile tactics, logistics and joint operations with the Army's 6th Brigade. In 1982, both 9 and 5 squadrons extended their reach beyond Australia once more, deploying a detachment to the Sinai Peninsula as part of the Multinational Force and Observers peacekeeping mission. Flying Iroquois helicopters in the harsh desert environment, the squadron provided vital air support, transporting personnel, conducting medical evacuations and assisting with reconnaissance and liaison tasks. The deployment demonstrated the squadron's operational versatility and its ability to serve with distinction, even in multinational, non-combat roles. However, by 1987, a significant restructuring of Australia's defence posture was underway. A government decision transferred responsibility for battlefield helicopters from the RAAF to the Army. Over the following year, 9 Squadron began transitioning to Townsville, where it was absorbed into the newly established 5th Aviation Regiment. On the 14th of February 1989, 9 Squadron was formally disbanded, closing a chapter that had spanned 2 wars and over 5 decades. Yet its legacy endured in doctrine, in training systems, and in the enduring partnership it forged between air and land forces across Australia's defence community.
Thanks for watching, and if you appreciate what we are doing, please subscribe and support us by checking out our merchandise shop.